Hello, Taiwan Talk podcast listeners. Keith Bencona here. Today, we've got another one of those extended interviews for you, recorded live on The Morning Show with Terry Engel. This one was recorded way back on November 4th. Already feels retro, almost. So clearly, I've gotten a little bit bad about posting these extended interviews on the stream. We've been doing them, I just have had a hard time posting them. Production team of one over here, so sometimes things take time. But expect one of these to be popping up each week from here on in. I'm going to get better about this. Anyway, before we get into this, I should note this was a Skype interview, so there are some sound quality issues. But the interview itself, I think a lot of good things are in there, so just try to listen past that if you can. This one pretty much speaks for itself, so I'm going to let it. Here it goes.
ICRT FM 108 minutes past 10, and time for this week's extended interview segment. And Keith, who have we got going on this week?
Well, I want to start with just a quick biographical question. Terry, you're a foreign guy. You're in Taiwan. That's correct to say?
I'm an expat. You're not an expat? Foreign at all. We can use whatever words. All right, expat. Both of us are expats, in fact.
Okay. But the show, for the most part, is about Taiwan. So, we may be bringing a somewhat different perspective to it, but at the end of the day, it's about Taiwan. And so, it's an interesting position that we're in. We're two expat dudes talking about our new home.
Yeah, that's right. This segment in particular, you're right, focuses on different aspects of Taiwan, and the program at large, if you will, does bridge that gap between Taiwan and what radio program that we might hear in North America or Europe or something like that. So yes, you're exactly right, Keith.
So you may think that this is a pretty unique gig that you've carved out for yourself, but I have found a pair of guys that you may be able to relate to.
Okay.
So what we're talking about today is we're going to be speaking to the hosts of the Sinica podcast.
Okay, go on.
This is basically a weekly show on current affairs, on China current affairs, to be more precise. They invite on China watchers of all stripes, whether they be journalists, academics, other expats doing interesting things, and talk about some of the biggest stuff going on in China. And it's hosted by a pair of two American expats living in Beijing. And so we got them here right now. It's Kaiser Guo and David Moser. Good morning to both of you. Thanks for being here.
Morning, Keith.
Morning. Hey, guys, what's up? What's happening?
How are you?
Okay, just making sure that you're there. Okay, good. All right.
And so typically, I think this Sinica podcast, it's kind of a laid-back sort of current affairs show. I know that you guys typically or sometimes are known to imbibe a couple beers on the program, but I'm assuming it's too early for that right now?
Yeah, it's too early. Yeah. I just had my coffee. The beer comes in a few hours.
All right, so we're doing the sans the alcohol in this hour. Okay, well, you guys have a lot of biographical information to go through. I mean, you guys have done a lot of stuff, so I'm just going to let that come out through the course of the interview. I don't want to go into that too much right now, so let's start just talking about the show itself. And one of the things that I really like about the show is it's very smart, but you don't have to be too smart to get into it. It's a very accessible way to get into current affairs in China, to learn about China. It's been around for about 5 years now, so I'm just kind of wondering, Kaiser, when you started it out, is that kind of what you were going for, is a more accessible way for the English-speaking community to kind of get to know China?
Yeah, Keith, you put your finger right on it. That's exactly what it was intended to be. It was supposed to be accessible. The idea when Jeremy Goldkorn and I actually started it, there was a real lacuna in the podcast scene. There wasn't a decent current affairs podcast on China. In fact, the China History podcast hadn't even kicked off yet. So we decided that since we both knew a lot of people, we have no trouble at all getting guests on. And we knew a guy with a studio who was going to, be happy to give us bandwidth to use in exchange for, bringing in a little bit of business to his company. It was called Pop Up Chinese, and teaching Mandarin to foreigners. So we decided that it was going to be, like you said, laid back, casual, and accessible. The idea was that people would be sort of eavesdropping on a conversation among three reasonably knowledgeable friends, or three or four, talking about what was in the news of late.
And you mentioned a second ago that you didn't really have too much of a problem getting guests for the show, and I think that has a lot to do with who you are in particular. Just to go through some of these bio things right now. So you're a writer in Beijing, you're a rock musician, you're a commentator on technology and politics. You've done a lot of work, and when we say rock musician, we really mean a rock star. You were one of the founding members of the Tang Dynasty all the way back in 1988. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your position in Beijing, your position in China more broadly, and kind of how that helped you make this show.
Well, I don't really chalk it up to anything except for longevity. I mean, I've been here for so damn long. Beijing used to be a real small town for such an enormous city. You did just sort of know everybody. And yes, yeah. I mean, I've been part of enough circles, in the sort of arts and culture circle, in the repertorial circle, the foreign correspondence circle. I'm a former journalist myself. In the sort of expat magazines circle, I was a columnist for that for quite some time. And then, I like to get out and socialize, and we've got the village pub down the street from where David and I live, and so, you meet a lot of people. Actually, I'd say a good 25% of the guests we bring on are just encountered over a beer at the Great Leap Brewery.
How long have you been rocking this podcast, Kaiser?
We started on April 1st, inauspicious, April 1st, 2010.
April 1st, 2010. Okay, all right, so 5 years.
So it's been around for a bit.
Yeah, all right.
It's matured for a bit.
Excellent. Tell me about some of the guests that you've had on. I know you said some of the people that you've just kind of randomly met, or maybe just expats, that have an opinion or have a comment or have some observations or a perspective on Beijing. But tell me about some of the. Have you kind of had anybody official on? Meaning that, like, has the government kind of recognized your program? Has there anybody in the media in China that has recognized this program and wanted to get involved?
Not official Chinese media. I mean, we've had people who write for Chinese media. For example, one of the great film critics of mainland China, his name goes by Ray, right?
Raymond Zhou.
Right, Raymond Zhou. So Raymond and I have known each other for a long time. He's still a fairly prominent figure in Chinese media, but as far as state media involvement, no, I don't believe so. Mm-hmm. Not that I can think of. We've had guests on, ranging from very prominent academics, people like Orville Schell, who now runs the U.S.-China program at the Asia Society, mm-hmm. and Timothy Garton Ash from Oxford University, who's one of probably the UK's best-known public intellectuals. Pankaj Mishra, who's a widely published author and another very prominent public intellectual.
Rana Mitter,
right? I think anyone wants to start listening to the show and is interested, because it really does very much talk about Taiwan as well, or at least about the Kuomintang. You should listen to a recent show that we did right after the anti-fascist parade that looked suspiciously like a fascist parade. Mm-hmm. And so Rana Mitter is an Oxford University professor of modern Chinese history and politics, and he was, I would say that was the best show we've done.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, he's just this incredibly insightful, and articulate, and witty, and humane, and funny man. And
in fact, don't listen to that first, because it'll go all downhill after that.
Don't want to start at the high water mark. Yeah, David, I want to get. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sort of ordinary folks. I mean, one of my very favorite podcasts that we did was just with a guy who I quite literally met over a beer. A young man named David Weeks, who organizes speech competitions in China, American debate competitions. He's terrific. He's a debater himself, so naturally he's kind of articulate himself. And, the work that he's doing is fascinating. Is a real eye opener. So yeah, ordinary folks like that, people who open businesses here, people who have. I've got a couple of people who are scheduled to come on who've done a bike ride where a motorcycle ride rather, where they've touched every province of mainland China.
Right, but excellent. Okay, guys, listen, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take ourselves a little bit of a break here. We just got to pause for commercials. We're going to jump into that. When we jump back here, we're going to kind of jump right into it in terms of what you guys are doing and kind of what service you're providing. And we're going to kind of draw a parallel to what we do here at ICRT and what the morning show does here and what Keith's podcast does, which Keith's is a very similar type of a podcast to what you guys are doing. So we'll kind of draw those parallels and we'll see what we make of it, what type of service we are trying to provide, where we're trying to go with all that. How's that? Stick around. Don't go anywhere. All right, this is the morning show with Terry here on ICRT. Short break. Back in a minute, we've got the guys from the Sinica podcast here, and we'll find out exactly what it is they're doing when we come back from the break.
Whoa. What the dealio?
Yep, it's time for a few important messages on ICRT.
All right, 10:21 in the morning, we return to the morning show with Terry here. And joining Keith and myself, we've got Kaiser Guo and we've got David Moser here. They're from the Sinica podcast, which kind of aims in the same direction that Keith's Taiwan This Week aims, in the sense that trying to bring some of the issues, some of the headlines to the rest of the world, I suppose. That's what you guys are doing.
Well, yeah, actually, that's kind of something I want to get into is how specific is the aim of this? Because, okay, so, it may be the case that your show is really just generally aimed at anybody in the English-speaking world, but I think here at ICRT, the focus really is on the English-speaking community, specifically here in Taiwan, and keeping them engaged in life here in Taiwan, keeping them informed in life here in Taiwan, and really feeling like this is kind of a home and something that they should care about here. Is your focus that specific on the expat community in China, or is it more general than that?
It's more general than that. I think we want to deliberately avoid just doing programs that were specifically focused at expatriates here. That gets a little, for us, it would be a little, limiting.
Well, again, maybe don't misunderstand what Keith is saying. This is the radio station at large is not aimed at expats at all. Right. It's aimed at Taiwanese folks mainly, of course, because obviously 95% of our listenership is Taiwanese. But it is aimed at cultivating an English environment and having an outlet for even the rest of the world and the Taiwanese themselves that want to hear the news in English, that want to hear English music, that kind of want to and are invited into Western culture to a certain degree, European culture, North American culture. Don't misunderstand that. We're certainly not aimed at the expat community. This is the English-speaking community.
I think Sinica has listeners overseas, people that don't think of themselves as expats, people that just are interested in China. We run into them all the time.
Probably most of them are outside. So I know that we have a big listenership in the State Department, in U.S. academic institutions, in all the China programs.
Right.
A lot of students of Chinese, and then of course just sort of general casual China watchers. Expatriates actually probably make a pretty small percentage. And then it turns out that we're actually quite a popular podcast on the China iTunes store, which suggests to me that
some Chinese are listening.
A lot of Chinese listeners.
Yeah, right. Excellent.
Well, another thing.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that another thing that, and you kind of actually talked about this specifically on your show recently, that one of the aims of your show is to kind of explicitly address some of the narratives, some of the beliefs that people have about China, and not necessarily correcting them, but at least stating them explicitly and making us aware that that some of the things that we think about. And maybe I want Terry to talk about this first. Would you say that that's one of the things that you're interested in taking a look at on your show?
I guess I don't really think about it in that sense. Okay. I guess the sense I look at it as more of a bridge between the two cultures. I'm not really aiming to. What I do on the morning show and what Keith does say during the news and with Taiwan This Week and Taiwan Talk and the other news programs that he does. I'm not a news guy, so I'm not interested in trying to get a message across, or as you use the word, narrative. I'm more interested in kind of making Western culture relevant to Taiwanese people and making Taiwanese culture relevant to the outside world and the expats that live here. So it's not really news specific, or there's no narrative specific. That covers a whole range of things. So in that sense, certainly the morning show here with Terry is different from Taiwan Talk, is, I'm guessing, different from Sinica, and we will let these guys answer that.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you guys have these things called commercials. That was strange. I don't quite know what that's all about.
Well, that is different about your show. Yeah, podcasts. That's a nice thing about podcasts.
Yeah, it's a labor of love. It's something we do just
or a labor of hate sometimes,
right?
Which motivates you also, right?
It's really it's very mission driven. I think we make no excuses for that. The idea, I mean, the very inception was that I think that it was important that there be a space to really kind of unpack some of the larger, more complex issues that get really kind of very peremptory treatment sometimes in just the headlines and the news that we see, to give reporters a chance to sort of talk about what ended up on the cutting room floor as they reported a story.
Yeah, I would say
bring in more angles that they weren't able to.
It allows some news stories to breathe. You sometimes get a 1 minute summary, or you get reporters who are very constrained by what they write.
Right, it's 800 words.
Yeah, and they sometimes have a lot of other opinions, and they're very interesting people who sometimes know much more than you would think from their byline, from the story. So we sometimes do a story that's big in the news, but we give reporters a chance to provide more background, and then also, just interesting.
But wouldn't that be the case in any country in the world that that's not specific to China, not in terms of the way you've described it?
It's particularly serious in China for a couple of reasons. First of all, I believe that the context here not only matters more, but is also of a higher order of complexity, and it's more alien, I think, than if you are, say, reading a story about something happening in Germany or in France or in Italy, where you have at least a certain degree of cultural overlap. So China is in odd case, does require a little more unpacking. But secondly, it's also because of the sheer importance of the bilateral relationship, because it just matters more. It's going to loom up more largely in all of our lives. So I think it takes on a greater urgency when it comes to China. The narratives around China that find themselves kind of quite deeply embedded in media reporting, and thus in thinking about China on the part of people in the Anglophone world, those are harder to uproot sometimes. So I think more effort is involved.
Let's go back to a thing that you said a moment ago, just this idea that the gap is even bigger than, maybe U.S. to France or U.S. to Spain or something like that. What kind of things? I mean, is that an aspect of the kind of topics that you take on? Is trying to give that concept to context? To bridge that gap between cultures? Is that something you guys are trying to take on as well?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely.
And so how do you go about doing that with a podcast? I mean, is it a matter of the topics that you choose, or is it a matter of the way that you discuss the topics, or the looking at them in ways that maybe people haven't thought of before?
That's right. I mean, it's in the topics that we choose. It's in the angles that we choose. It's in the questions that we ask of the people. It's in the guests that we decide to have on. It's in the actual sort of framing of questions that we do. A good fair bit of preparation ahead of these. We're not going into these flying by the seat of our pants. We've read the books. If we're talking about a book, we're familiar with the writer's body of work. We actually spend some time and hammer out what we think are good, thoughtful, penetrating questions.
Yeah, and I think also we don't steer clear of topics that are controversial and get into arguments or bring our particular points of view or even bias into it. Because I think that's a good way I think listeners like that, because you don't really understand a topic until you've seen it through the lens of different viewpoints. And so the object is not to present an objective talk show where you just simply ask neutral questions and draw a guest out. It sometimes turns into sometimes a very messy but interesting discussion that acts as like a prism for all the different viewpoints. It's not always inclusive. If you listen to a podcast on traditional Chinese medicine, which we have, you will not get a overall view of traditional Chinese medicine that you could use in a classroom to give you a basic introduction. You will get a very rowdy, opinionated, a lively discussion that sheds a great light on it and gives a lot of cross-cultural information. So that's the kind of thing that the podcast tends to evolve into.
Let me ask you guys this. Of course, outside of China, there's and especially in the United States, there's a lot of sort of sentiment that there's a lot of censorship in China, that there's a lot of media blocking, that there's a lot of sort of oppression of certain kinds of opinions. That's certainly the ideas formed about China from the States and even from here in Taiwan, no question. So in any way, has the state tried to block your podcast? Have you run into any problems with your show specifically? You said it's available on China iTunes, so obviously this is something that's available to just about anybody who has access to iTunes. And by the sounds of it, or at least from what you guys are saying, you kind of don't pull any punches in terms of what your opinions might be, or the presenting a number of different perspectives on a news story.
That's right. We have not encountered anything by way of censorship, and the idea that China is a very heavily censored media environment is absolutely correct, and there's no denying that. We've been lucky. I touch wood. In one of my theories is that simply, I think it's simply true that English language media here, because it doesn't reach so many people, it isn't considered so dangerous. I have an operating theory that says that anyone whose English would have been good enough to follow a highly colloquial podcast like this, their English would be too good to be tasked with such a low-level assignment.
And they would likely to be more sympathetic to what we're saying also.
Well, yeah, again, you're even in saying that kind of putting a slant on it that yes, indeed. So let me just ask you blankly then. So what you're saying is, if this podcast was in Chinese, you think it would be censored?
Yeah, probably.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Right.
But to be fair, we're very balanced. I mean, we do not bring on unalloyed dragon slayers to come spew venom and rant about. Well, one of our hosts does that once in a while, but we always balance it off. I mean, I think David and I both have extremely moderate instincts, and we're both highly empathetic to the Chinese position.
Yeah, I think if you took the podcast and translated it into Chinese, actually there would be very little that people in the top echelons would really object to, because if you speak with those people, they're not all complete ideologues. They're pragmatists. They see the issues, and I think because we don't deal in a one-sided way and in a sort of accusatory way with issues like Tibet and these kinds of things, that we almost act as a balance for the kind of reflexive narratives that you see in some of the major news outlets. So I think that, and then the other thing is, Kaiser, and it's probably just luck that I think we still fly under the radar a little bit because it's a podcast. We don't pop up all the time cited in the English language news and the New York Times and this and that. And if we did, a little red flags might be raised, and people might actually go looking for us. But so far that hasn't happened. So far we're pretty free to, discuss anything on the air and say whatever we want about it.
To keep that, at least knock on wood again, yeah. To keep that balanced approach that you were talking about a second ago, I mean, do you find that you have to go a little bit outside of yourself to really be able to see it from that other perspective? Because, I mean, I think sometimes, especially when we're talking about cross-cultural things, some of the rationale are, kind of foreign to us. I mean, it's, they're coming from a very different set of assumptions, sometimes the people that we're talking about. And so is that ever a stretch for you to kind of get there to that balanced place?
Well, for me personally, I can't speak for David, but I am, somebody who has always been blessed as being kind of bicultural. I try to inhabit the two worlds, and so the empathy comes pretty easily to me from both sides. If you take any issue that's sort of a hotly debated one that relates to China, I can generally play myself in intellectual chess to stalemate. I know the arguments pretty well on either side. And I'm often persuaded by the arguments on both sides, and so I think that that helps me. I think to draw people out and give them room to make the arguments on both sides.
And so being balanced is a little easier, you're suggesting, as a result of growing up biculturally, of course, being of Chinese heritage and growing up in the States.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at.
I think also just being a long timer, the longevity is one thing, because it's very easy to be critical of things like the one-child policy if you've only lived outside of China and you really don't have much of an idea of what it's like to live here. But if you've lived here, as I have for almost 30 years, you tend to start to understand what the government is faced with and what policymakers have to grapple with. And you see these problems that are so monumental that I find myself siding with them sometimes, saying, well, what do you want them to do? And I think that has a lot to do with it. I think foreigners who've been here a long time, and we have some on our show, bring an insight and bring in a sort of instincts about life here that you're not going to get in sort of average media outlets.
Yeah, right. So this is exactly what I was kind of getting at, maybe even in my question 2 questions ago, which is, I guess I was also asking in some way, how much empathy is there in your program as well for the Chinese government and some of the policies they make? Because ultimately, this is a program that aims to kind of accurately represent what's happening in China. At least I'm guessing that's what your intent is.
In defense, or not in defense. Kaiser is not exactly unique, but he's very unusual in the sense that he really is very conscious of these narratives.
Right.
And he knows and has known for a long time most of the major news reporters here who cover China, and so his can I say shit on the air?
No, you cannot.
Okay.
Please.
Sorry,
Thank you.
Sorry. His feces detector is very highly his bovine feces detector is very highly developed. So he can sense these instinctive headline grabbing narratives that are put out there for cynical reasons, just because editors like this kind of thing. And I think Sinica is a kind of a check against this kind of creeping, simplistic narratives that just are just the narrative that the newspaper articles and the media are filled with.
Yeah, right.
To be lauded for at least being a voice that does that. I think he's biculturalness is part of it, but I think it's also just simply that he's been here a long time.
Yeah, by empathy, that's exactly sort of what I was getting at as well, because there certainly does seem to be. I don't know if I should say something like this, but there does seem to be in U.S. media, certainly in Taiwan media, a lot of anti-China sentiment. So again, I was always trying to draw out of you guys that aspect of it, and it sounds like, of course, having lived there and understanding the situations a little bit better, that's the ultimate goal, is to really just kind of get the stories out, maybe from behind the stories or from behind the headlines.
Your use of the word empathy is exact. I mean, empathy is, if there's one word that I think I would want associated with the show, it would be that. I've always tried to nudge people toward an informed empathy. Empathy is a wonderful quality in that it does not require you to abdicate your own values in trying to understand the viewpoints of another. You step out of your shoes, you don't surrender them, right? So I can still be an American who believes in freedom of expression, who believes in the universality of human rights, who believes in rule of law and all of these other wonderful things, and still manage to see things from a Chinese perspective. But it needs to be informed empathy. And I think there are 2 components to this. One is that it requires a lot of work. You need to understand a lot of context, a lot of history, a lot of what has transpired in China in order to have that. But more important, or equally important to that, you need to to understand a lot about your own history. And this is something that I've come to really realize and has become a major factor in my thinking, is that so often we sit on this side of the chasm. We Americans, we Canadians, we sit on this side of this chasm where we enjoy all of these values, these institutions, these elements of our political culture that we so prize, but we're unaware of how we got here. We've lost sight of the historical path that we took, which was often one with lots. I mean, we left a lot of blood on that path and made a lot of sacrifice for it. We shouldn't assume that this is a natural end state. We shouldn't assume that all cultures, all polities arrive at that or are able to make that leap instantaneously. Now we live in this compressed, this common present where, what Putin's Russia or what ISIL or ISIS is doing, or what Bashar al-Assad's doing, or what Xi Jinping is doing are all, they're in front of us on our computer screens every day, and so it's all the more important that we understand the reasons why this chasm exists, and that we expend real effort to acquire the knowledge, the context, and the self-knowledge to be able to be empathetic.
All right, we are going to cut this one just a little bit early. We had one more segment that day, but that was just a little bit of on-air silliness, a little bit of a game, a gag, and those things really work better live. So we're going to spare that for you podcast listeners. But once again, we do want to note we were speaking there to the hosts of the Sinica podcast, Kaiser Guo and David Moser. You can find their show online at the Pop-Up Chinese website. Pop-Up Chinese, just a quick note, they are a Chinese language learning website, do a couple other things, and they are partnering with Sinica, so that's where you can find the show. I'm going to put a link in the episode description, make it a little bit easier to find, or, just Google Sinica Podcast, probably the easiest way, get you right there. Big thank you one last time to the Sinica guys, once again for coming on the show. Had a lot of fun that morning. And thank you all out there for listening. For ICRT and The Morning Show with Terry Engel, I am Keith Menconi. See you all next time.